All right, so I am now here with Kale to talk about guns and gun reform in the US or lack thereof, obviously, in light of the recent tragic mass shooting in Uvalde, Texas. I think that, there's obviously been a lot of commentary going on about why we can't pass meaningful gun reform in the US. So I think I want to start with that question. Kale, I know you have some thoughts and comments about that. And I just want to say, from my perspective, it seems like the two dominant strains of commentary when it comes to this question of why we can't pass meaningful gun reform in the US one sort of centers on the culture of guns in the US, and then the other centers on the our political system. And I don't think that the two are necessarily mutually exclusive. But I want to start with the cultural narrative, because that's the one that, quite honestly, I find a little less convincing. And I don't think that it's completely wrong. I do think that there are some components of culture that play into this problem, and we can get into that. But broadly speaking, the cultural narrative around why we can't pass gun reform is basically that we are in a sick society that is so saturated by love of guns and worship of guns that we collectively are unable to generate the political will to pass gun reform. And a lot of people, I think, in the days after Uvalde have been kind of, taking this line, like, what is wrong with our culture? Why can't, we collectively pass gun reform? And I just want to read a quote quickly from the New Yorker's Jelani Cobb. He's a columnist there, and he wrote an article that came out pretty recently of the gun problem. He writes, "Some of this is on Second Amendment fundamentalists and the politicians who translate their zealotry into law. The rest is on every one of us who has yet to find the courage, the creativity, or the resolve to stop it." I think that is representative, again, like I said, of this kind of narrative that we have a sort of cultural sickness that prevents us from moving forward with gun reform. Now, the political, the kind of explanation that centers on our political systems obviously looks at the fact that we live in a pretty anti-democratic system. The kind of big thing that keeps coming up is the filibuster, right? Without filibuster reform, we will not be able to pass anything close to what is necessary to combat gun violence in the Senate. So I have a few more comments on that, or I could say a little more on that, but let me hand it over to you, Kale, because I know that you have some thoughts on this as well.
Yeah, well, I think how you laid it out is probably how most people see it. And I think you're right that they're both relevant issues, that the political system is in fact highly undemocratic, and it's like riddled with gridlock, that nothing substantial has really gotten through any of our legislatures in the last couple decades, really, like, aside from, it's like a miracle when something does actually finally pass. Right. And the legislation, or people pushing for legislation around gun control, or about banning certain weapons or certain features on weapons, background checks, obviously has been one of the most prominent places where, like, politicians actually have been trying to push. Like, there hasn't been a massive push for single payer, and it's failed every single time. Whereas, like, with guns, it gets pushed, seemingly every other year, and nothing except for a couple of minor adjustments under the Trump administration have actually passed.
Right.
And same with, like, the cultural arguments. I think, like, it's totally true that, like, there is truly, like, there's a lot of people who have made a culture around this. But I think with both of them, it's confusing effects for causes, that they, in both cases, these aren't the things that are driving the problem. It's the results of actual underlying problems within our society, within economics, within democracy, that, like, actually then produce these outcomes. So I think, when it comes to the cultural stuff, like, it's interesting because, like, when you see the polling on guns, on, like, do you think there should be more or less gun control or restrictions on guns? Most people say yes. Most people overwhelmingly, like, agree to some extent of gun control. But when you ask, like, certain questions, you get more revealing answers. So, like, one question that Gallup had asked was, would you support legislation that would ban guns broadly for the American public, but allow police to keep guns, that they would still have weapons, the population broadly wouldn't.
Hmm.
And something like 80% of people said they don't support that.
Right. Yeah.
That there really is like a culture, but it's also like it's in response to real things. Not
Hmm.
everyone. A lot of again, we can like bracket out like kind of the subcultural, like people who it's for, they would claim for sport or for shooting practice or something, or it's just like they like having them, they like touching them and stroking them. I don't know. There's that, sure, but like obviously, I think a lot of it comes down to a legitimate concern, whether it's responding to legitimate like circumstances is maybe situation by situation and geographically different and dispersed, but there's like actual anxiety over feeling that I need to protect myself,
Right.
and that atomization is real, and you can't like
Yeah.
you know and again, if you're in like an inner city, it's going to be far more real. It's part of your day-to-day life that you actually probably there's people who actually do live lives where like they're fighting for survival, depending on like the neighborhood you're in. But for a lot of people, obviously that's not the case, but that still is this atomization that
Yeah.
has to be addressed.
Right. Right. That's very real. And I guess, obviously from a materialist perspective, the answer to why we have that culture is because of our completely broken and self-sabotaging government that, consistently undermines itself, produces no public trust, and basically tells American citizens you're on your own. We've talked about that plenty of times on the show before. So it's not that the highly individualistic culture produces this broken government. It's the other way around, as you
Right.
said. And I want to say, just on the topic of public opinion toward various gun reforms, lots of people have pointed out, and I think it's worth repeating, that of like an overwhelming majority of the public, like we're talking 80 to 90%, supports what is sort of commonly called common sense gun reforms, right? So that's like mandatory and universal background checks, closing the gun show loophole, so to speak. And I think a pretty significant majority of the US public even supports a ban on assault weapons, if not, handguns and other guns that aren't assault weapons. So I think that again kind of speaks to the shortcomings of just a purely cultural narrative. I don't think that there is, as we've been saying, I do think that there is a kind of like atomized and individualized American culture, which may or may not be sort of replicated in other parts of the world. But at the same time, I don't think that we have a culture of death, so to speak. I don't think that Americans. I mean, I think that there's a lot of evidence showing that most Americans support, like I said, what is called common sense gun reforms, even if opinions are divided on some of the other issues. But I think, a larger problem, which again goes back to kind of the broken political system, is even if the US government was able to pass these common sense gun reforms on a national level, which they aren't, that wouldn't be enough to stop gun violence, because there are just so many guns in circulation already that without something more drastic, like, for example, a program of mandatory buybacks, we just won't be able to tackle the problem at all.
Right. Well, and also, like, again, insofar as it's a problem of atomization, or individuals feeling insecure or that they need to protect themselves or their families, that's basically an economic situation.
Mm-hmm.
That's an
Yeah.
economic problem. It's people feeling that they don't have what they need to get by, that they're worried about their actual social standing, whether it's and for a lot of people, again, like it's easy to like kind of hold up in your head the middle class suburban white gun owner or something as like the template, and like that's again probably a portion of this population, but obviously people who own guns, who use guns, who it's across the board. It's I think it's something, most people don't own guns, but like there's people who are in inner cities where like handgun violence is the predominant issue, not assault rifles.
Right.
But again, that atomization that people feel, like it's largely stemming from poverty, and it's not the fact that everyone who feels anxious is in fact in poverty, but it's the fact that there is poverty, and poverty leads to people making decisions that you probably wouldn't make if you weren't dealing with like dire straits, that you end up, finding alternative means of getting by. You find illegal means of making income or getting the things you need, because you find, just trying to get a regular job and, have a regular income that meets all of your needs isn't happening. That's not, that's not available. And so you end up so poverty ends up being kind of the root of this insecurity, of this, and of people turning to guns and gun violence as a means of getting by. And that's something that I think, like, going back to the political problem of, why is it that politicians don't do anything or are unable to do something? A lot of it, I think, comes down to that it's there's this kind of tacit understanding that the problem is an underlying structural one, that creates, a population of people who end up, engaged in owning or engaged in gun violence. But they can only ever really propose, these piecemeal or these minor reforms, because they don't actually have the means to, or not only the means, but like for a lot of these people, like they don't really want to actually deal with the root causes. So like most of the Democrats would say today, the problem is not, they would say the problem is our Republicans on the other side of the aisle, that the Republicans are the reason why we can't do anything, and that we should try to just push something through, and at the very least, like, see where everyone stands. And so then you can say, like, okay, you Republican, you gotta, man up. You can't take that donor money anymore. And it's this like totally kind of voluntary understanding of politics that is bound to lose. And it's like becoming deeply aggravating, where like I'm from Connecticut. I don't live in Connecticut right now, but like Richard Blumenthal is like my former senator when I was living in Connecticut. He still is the senator now. And he comes out after every, mass shooting and says, Republicans just won't let us do what we need to do. And he gives a moving speech, and it's truly usually like jerking, like it's like deeply upsetting because this is a horrific situation. But the actual political solution, like, is just insulting. It's like, it's because it's not actually dealing with the problem. So I want to, if you don't mind, I want to actually just run a clip of him so I can break this down exactly what I mean when I'm talking about, because this is him last week, this is May 24th, speaking on the Senate floor about the recent Texas shooting.
Common sense, sensible steps can prevent the senseless, needless violence. There is no panacea, but there are actions we can take. We are not without agency. Now, we need to be very blunt and recognize that opposition to these measures is bankrolled and emboldened and enabled by the guns lobby's dark money, by its threats and intimidation, by its encouragement. And until my colleagues have the courage to stand up to that gun lobby, they will continue in its thrall and its grip. And they will continue to be complicit. And some on our side, some who have demonstrated the courage to stand up and speak out, have shown that we have the power to take action.
But yeah, so basically, and that's like 5 or 6 minutes into a speech where it again, it's very moving, but ultimately it boils down to, they don't have the willpower to give up the money. If only they, grew a heart. And we can't wait for Republicans to grow a heart, because this is how politics works for everything. It's like, why is it that the Democrats won't, support single payer? Why is it that, there's like a million things that would make life so much better for the vast majority of working people that they won't touch because they have an interest in maintaining an economy that is in the interests of billionaires, of corporations that,
Yeah.
that those are their primary constituents as politicians. And so, the Republicans, are not going to move because why would they? They're not worried about, not being reelected. And they're very happy to take the money. It's just useful. It's like one more donor.
Yeah, Blumenthal's speech, and also relatedly, Beto O'Rourke recently confronted Governor Abbott in a kind of big display. I think that both of these people are like obviously well intentioned. I believe that they like deeply care about this issue, but I think that these grand speeches also kind of reveal the limits of consciousness raising, right? I mean, I've been noticing also, basically since Sandy Hook, but like especially now, every time there is a horrific, tragic mass shooting, there's kind of a spate of commentary that comes out that's basically just wallowing in nihilism, right? Like, and this is kind of what I was getting at when we started talking at the beginning. There seems to be a new genre of commentary that's like, oh my God, like things are so bad, like thoughts and prayers won't do anything. Like we've basically like passed the point of no return, like we've gone beyond the pale. I'm not criticizing anybody for writing this type of commentary. Like, again, like I totally see where it comes from, but I think, again, it just reveals that we sort of reached the limits of consciousness raising, right? Like, what is there left to say, or like, what kind of propaganda is there left to disseminate that could actually change things? And I think that, again, goes to show that it isn't a matter of people not being woken up to the truth of what's going on in America. I also saw, like, I know that recently people have been bringing up this idea of, what if we released like gory crime scene photos from the school shootings, or like, release like these photos of dead children to kind of like shock the public into action, the way that famously the photos of Emmett Till did, or like photos from the Vietnam War. And I again understand the impulse, I think, but I don't think that like more propaganda is what actually is the solution here.
Right. Yeah. And that's because the world is driven by power, not by ideas.
Right.
It's not everyone can have most people in America agree there's a problem and want a number of legislation to be passed that would vastly improve like our safety and our living standards. It doesn't happen because people actually have real material incentives, that these politicians actually have real material incentives that they're not going to be able to, push back on just because they have a conscience. Like that's, so that's where it's like, if Blumenthal or O'Rourke or, others were serious about doing something about gun violence, they would be trying to do political organizing that actually put pressure on the opposition in a way where like it threatens their ability to govern. Now, I don't mean that in like a super kind of mysterious, like violent way, but like in the sense of like you actually have to jeopardize their ability to get reelected, or to jeopardize the conditions in their district for for profitability, for business to get by. That's actually, historically, we know this because we've been doing, democracy in some form for about 200 years, give or take, probably a lot less, but that like, we know that like, that's actually what changes things, that you actually need disruption that actually affects not just the politicians, but also like elites, ruling class people, the businesses and corporations, their ability to get by, so that they then say, no, we need to actually move on this. That's, and like, it's not just, and it's I'm bringing up profitability because it can't just be protests, because like we had the Parkland shooting protests, students were marching across the country, massive protests, and like obviously like all those students who did that did the right thing, and that we probably need more protests too, but the point is just that they didn't work. So like, we don't say like, okay, protest doesn't work. We say, well, we probably need more protests, and we need actual mass action in a way that's directed in a way that deals with stability in society, that actually upends normal, flows of profit of the politician's ability to be reelected, that you actually have to get at like what keeps these people in power,
right?
Not just tug at their heartstrings, because that
Right,
doesn't
exactly.
do anything about their political status.
Right. Well, I think that's a good note to wrap up on. But before we go, I want to quickly shout out Nivedita Majumdar's article from a few years ago. Unfortunately, this problem obviously keeps coming up again and again. But she wrote an article a few years ago in Jacobin, which is called "The Socialist Case for Gun Control." And I quickly wanted to shout that out because I think. I haven't seen it so much this time around, but I do feel that after a mass shooting, oftentimes there will be some quarters of the left that kind of come out against gun control, because I think the main arguments are that any new laws will sort of be used disproportionately against Black people. And then the other argument is, there's a section of the left that really likes guns and fetishizes guns and, thinks that we need guns in order to protect ourselves against the government. That's kind of like a shadowy inverse, right, of the right-wing preoccupation with guns. So I just want to quickly say that, Nivedita's article is really great and I think takes on both of those claims head on. So definitely check that out.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. And again, I think maybe the upshot of this is just the fact that this is a political issue, like other political issues, and the way that we have to deal with it is through mass organizing. You won't have the outcomes that benefit working people's lives realized until you actually have working people organized. So actions through unions, through political parties, through actually affecting again the general stability of society that's working in the interests of rich people.
Right.
So that's I think the only way out of this, and it sucks because it's hard, but
it's hard and it's boring. We always give the same solution because that's what it is. But yeah. If you like this video from The Jacobin Show, please hit like and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.